Our first caller is calling from London, England, from Peter from the UK. Peter, you are in London, is that correct?
Yes, that is, Steve. Yes.
I thought so. Yes, welcome.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Steve. Happy New Year.
Yeah, same to you.
Thanks, Steve. My question today, I've reading the Gospels, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they almost appear out of nowhere in the beginning of the Gospels, and I've never actually thought about the origin of those two sects. Do you have any idea, sort of, their origins or where they come from, and how such a devout group missed mark especially when it came to their engagement with Jesus?
Yeah, well, the Pharisees and the Sadducees did not exist in the Old Testament. So when the Old Testament closes in Malachi, we've heard nothing about them thus far. But as you say, once we get to Matthew, which is 400 years later, 400 years after Malachi, Matthew's gospel has, the place is crawling with the Pharisees and Sadducees, and you think, well, as you say, where'd they come from? Who are they? These groups arose during the intertestamental period, that 400-year period between the Old and the New Testament. And they probably arose around the time of the subjection of Israel to either the Ptolemies in Egypt or the Seleucids in Syria. But the Pharisees have their precursors in the Hasidim, which were the conservative, faithful Jews who stood for the law and resisted the tyranny of Antiochus Epiphanes in about 167 BC approximately. And they were greatly persecuted. And now they weren't called the Pharisees at that time. They were called the Hasidim, and they're not exactly the same group probably, but the Pharisees almost certainly grew up from those roots. The word Pharisee means separated ones, and therefore these were people who saw themselves as not even necessarily compromising with the majority of the people of Israel, but separated even from the rest by their strict adherence to the law. Now, the Pharisees not only were loyal to the law, they were also loyal to what was called the traditions of the elders. This is, in this sense, they differed from Jesus and they differed from the Sadducees, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the Pharisees held to the traditions of the elders, essentially as if they were on the same level with Scripture. Now, Orthodox Jews today recognize that they are the direct descendants, in terms of beliefs, from the Pharisees of the first century. We think the word Pharisee is a negative. If you call somebody a Pharisee, we're taking the term from our knowledge of the New Testament, where they were the opponents of Christ. They were very compromised in ways that Jesus took them to task about. He called them hypocrites. And so to us, the word Pharisee is a bad word. It's always been a bad word in Christian circles because of their behavior in the Gospels. But actually, the Pharisees were simply the Jewish sect. There were only about 3,000 of them, although they did have religious influence disproportionate to their numbers. But they were the ones who held to the law of Moses very strictly and to the traditions of the elders. Now, the traditions of the elders are those which later became written down, not in Jesus' day, but a couple centuries later. They were written down as what we call the Talmud. Now, Orthodox Jews today are Talmudists. They believe in Moses and the law and the prophets, but they also believe in the Talmud. And they would recognize themselves as the successors of the Pharisees, because that's exactly what distinguished the Pharisees. Now, apart from the Pharisees, there were other Jewish sects. There were some that were even more strict than they were, but probably didn't go with all the traditions of the elders, but had their own traditions. And they were called the Essenes. And they were the ones who lived out in the Dead Sea area and who are almost certainly the ones who produced what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were a remote, monastic almost kind of a sect. They were even more separated from normal society in order to remain clean and undefiled, even more than the Pharisees. They even saw the Pharisees as compromised. But within the Jewish society, not including the Essenes, the Pharisees were the strictest Jews. And again, they strictly held to what Moses said and to what the traditions the elders said. Now, Jesus actually rebuked them for that because he said by keeping the traditions of the elders, they sometimes nullify what Moses said, which is always the case whenever a group thinks that they can have the Bible plus whatever traditions of their group. Well, it's always going to be the scriptures that suffer and are compromised in favor of the traditions. Now, the Pharisees believed that in addition to the written Torah, the law that was given to Moses at Mount Sinai, which was passed down to them, they believed there was also what they called an oral Torah, that Moses had spoken quite a few laws that were never written down, but were passed down through Joshua and through the other leaders of Israel through the ages, and that they were what became known as the traditions of the elders, and later were written down in the Talmud. Now, the oral law is not able to be documented. I mean, we don't have any record of Moses doing this, and it wasn't written down even in Jesus' day, 1,400 years after Moses. It still wasn't written down. So anyone can claim that Moses said certain things, but who could prove it? To my mind, this is very much like the claim of the Catholic Church that holds that the Bible and the traditions of the church are equal, just like the Pharisees believed that the Bible and the traditions of the elders or the rabbis were equal in weight. The Catholic Church holds that the Bible and the traditions of the Catholic Church are, and they believe, similar to the Pharisees, that there's not only the written scriptures, but there's the spoken scriptures, the spoken traditions that were decided by bishops in various councils and so forth since then. But once again, just as the Pharisees, by putting human traditions on the same level with Scripture, ended up compromising the Scriptures, I believe the Roman Catholic Church has done the same. Their traditions often, because they hold them, have been made to compromise their loyalty to the Scriptures. I mean, for example, the tradition of the clergy being celibate. Well, Paul said that the elders, the leaders of the church, the bishops, should be married men with children. So, I mean, you've got Paul saying one thing, you've got the tradition saying something else. They always go with the tradition. They'll always compromise the Scriptures for their traditions. And that's true of any group. Now, Protestants have their traditions too. And we need to be careful not to judge too harshly, some other group, because we also need to look and see, well, does my denomination have traditions that we will not compromise our traditions, even if the Scriptures are against them? That's where the Pharisees were at with their Old Testament Scriptures and the traditions. Now, the Sadducees, no one knows exactly how their movement arose, but it probably rose up either before or after the Pharisees around the same time. It is thought that the word Sadducee may have developed from the name Zadok. Now, Zadok was a very famous priest in the time of David, and God spoke very well of Zadok. He was a faithful priest of Israel. And some think that the word Sadducee is a variation on the name, based on the name Zadok. They were typically the denomination in Judaism that the priests belonged to. Not all the priests, perhaps, and not only priests, but the Sadducees were a smaller group than the Pharisees. But they kind of held the loyalty of the priesthood, the Sanhedrin, the more ruling class. So the Pharisees were more influential culturally and religiously, but the Sadducees had more political power because the nation's rulers typically were Sadducean in their beliefs. Now, the Sadducees didn't believe in the traditions of the elders, just like Jesus didn't. So in that sense, Jesus and the Sadducees both agreed against the Pharisees. But the Sadducees also, according to Josephus, and some feel that this needs to be interpreted and may not have been interpreted correctly, but Josephus seems to say that the only scriptures the Sadducees accepted were the 5 books of Moses, whereas the Pharisees received, Moses and the prophets and all, the Psalms and all that. But the Sadducees apparently only believed in the Torah. And they didn't believe in angels, they didn't believe in spirits, and they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And those are things where they clashed with Jesus, especially on the resurrection. The Pharisees did believe in the resurrection of the dead, and Jesus did too. So whereas the Sadducees and Jesus agreed with each other against the traditions of the elders contra the Pharisees, The Pharisees and Jesus agreed on the resurrection of the dead doctrine contra the Sadducees. So Jesus was not on either side. But his theology was probably closer, at least in his interpretation of Scripture, perhaps, to the Pharisees. In any case, he wasn't part of either group. But these groups had grown up, and they were rival, sort of like there's rival denominations, in Christianity. The Sadducees were the ones who typically minimized the supernatural, and where the Pharisees had no problem with the supernatural elements of the Old Testament. So those are kind of a survey of those two groups.
Yeah, they sound like two political parties almost, one being more conservative, one being more liberal to the doctrines of, to the belief system of the time.
We evangelicals would probably describe the Pharisees as the more conservative, and the Sadducees as the more liberal, because in Christianity, it's the liberals who don't believe in the supernatural, and it's the conservatives who believe the whole Bible. On the other hand, scholars usually describe the Sadducees as the conservatives because they only accepted the Torah and they did not accept the traditions of the elders, which were, extra biblical, beyond Scripture. So, it depends on what we call liberal or conservative, but they were like two different denominations, or maybe like two different movements, because in Christianity, we not only have many denominations, we also have the liberal side and the conservative side. So almost every denomination has a liberal branch and a conservative branch. There's different denominations of Lutherans. Some of them are liberal, some are conservative. There's different branches of Presbyterians and Methodists. Some of them, in each case, liberal and some conservative. Same with Baptists. Same with Episcopalians. So, you do have these different general ideologies, and the Sadducees and Pharisees were different ideological camps and not very friendly with each other generally.
Oh, no, thank you very much, Steve. That's really helped to provide context to those two groups. So I really appreciate you taking the time to answer my question. Thank you.
All right, Peter. Now get some